This recording is going to cover Chapter 12, Part 1, and we're going to start focusing on the central nervous system. So as we're talking about the CNS, or the central nervous system, we are speaking of the brain and the spinal cord. So Chapter 12 will cover these. We're going to do this video will cover the brain, and then the second one will cover the spinal cord. So when we're talking about the brain, it is going to be essentially this process right here. We've got our brain and our spinal cord, and there's a term called cephalization, and basically that just means that there is evolutionary development of the anterior portion of the CNS. So if this is our CNS with the brain and the spinal cord, this is going to be the anterior part of it, and then this will be the posterior part of it. So what basically we're saying is that we have specialized with the anterior part being more developed, which is what we have with our brain. So 12.1, looking at overall brain development. So when the brain actually starts developing, it will start as what is called a neural tube. And basically this neural tube is in embryonic development is where we are talking about. So the neural tube will become this one long tube, and as it actually expands, it will then form three primary vesicles. So here's our neural tube, and by tube it really does look like a long skinny tube. So there's our neural tube, and basically what we mean by it becoming three primary vesicles is there will be a section that is going to be section 1, section 2, and then section 3. So you will have vesicle 1, 2, and 3. So these three sections will become your prosencephalon, your mesencephalon, and your rhombencephalon. And then your neural tube will continue, but these are the three sections that will be the anterior portion of your neural tube. So we're going to have our prosencephalon, our mesencephalon, and our rhombencephalon. So these three sections will then continue to develop. Your prosencephalon will become two different sections. Your mesencephalon will stay its one section, and your rhombencephalon, or your hindbrain, will become two separate sections. So that's what's going on here. Basically, when you look at it, it goes from one tube to three vesicles to essentially 5 regions. So your prosencephalon will become your telencephalon and your diencephalon. That's these guys right here. Your mesencephalon will stay your mesencephalon, and your rhombencephalon will become your metencephalon and your myelencephalon. So this is the way I like to remember is how your vesicles of the brain get developed. So remember, one neural tube to 3 vesicles to 5 regions. Here is a great example of that. So here's our region 1, region 2, region 3, and then your spinal cord will continue. These 3 regions, prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon, will become your telencephalon and your diencephalon. And then it will become your metencephalon. So prosencephalon becomes this one. Your mesencephalon stays your mesencephalon. And then your rhombencephalon, or your hindbrain, becomes your metencephalon and your myelencephalon. So what I do want you guys to know is what each of these essentially will then become. So here's a great breakdown in the chart to be able to see this, but then here is also a great breakdown to be able to see. The telencephalon will eventually become the cerebral hemispheres. Your diencephalon will essentially become these regions right here. Your mesencephalon will become the midbrain. Metencephalon will be pons and medulla, and myelencephalon will be the medulla oblongata. So basically what we're doing is we are going from a neural tube that looks like this, and through a very complex process, our neural tube essentially will become this and then this. And these sections right here of prosencephalon will kind of be here. They were here, and then they essentially become this section. And then the next part was your mesencephalon, which will essentially stay here, and that will become your here, and then your rhombencephalon, which becomes your metencephalon, and your myelencephalon will essentially become here and here. So that's kind of the progression of how this long neural tube gets converted from a tube into the actual brain structures. So that's kind of an easy kind of way to see how that works. Okay, so just kind of what I drew for this brain development. The brain grows faster than the skull, so it must fold to occupy space. That is the important part. So it will actually fold inward. And so you can see how here's our neural tube, and then we essentially start folding in on ourselves like this. So when we get to the brain, the final brain region, the final organization, there's going to be 4 primary areas of our brain's region. So we will have the cerebral hemispheres, there will be a right and a left because they're on either side. Your diencephalon, which essentially is going to become some very important structures that we'll talk about a little bit later. Your brainstem and your cerebellum. So this is kind of an example of my lovely little coloration drawing right here. So that's the development of the nervous system. It's cephalization, so we have a very prominently organized anterior part of our central nervous system. But a couple terms and a couple ways that the organization occurs. So when you see the term gray matter, what this means is that it is going to be short, non-myelinated neurons. And the reason it's non-myelinated, the way you know that gray is non-myelinated, remember myelin is a fatty substance. A fatty substance is white. If you don't have the fatty substance, it looks gray. And this would also be cell bodies because the cell bodies would be the soma, and there is actually no myelin around that, therefore it is gray. If you have white matter, this is going to be myelinated axons with some unmyelinated as well. However, because you have the myelinated axons there, it is going to come with that white fatty protein, white fatty substance that will make it look a little bit white. So that's some terms you need to know, white matter and gray matter. That's very, very important. And as we continue, you'll kind of see how these will come up in a couple different places. When we say white matter and gray matter, basically what we mean is, like you can see right here, white matter is the lighter, whereas gray is going to be the darker. But that is the terms for those. Within our brainstem, cerebral hemispheres, our midbrain, and our diencephalon, all of these areas in our spinal cord, all of these will have this pattern of white matter and gray matter. So that's very, very, very important. Again, you can see here's the white matter and the gray matter, and then you can also see white matter, gray matter here. So that's kind of how it will all work. Another term is going to be ventricles. So when we're talking ventricles, these are the areas of your central nervous system that will contain fluid, and that fluid is going to be called CSF. And basically CSF is primarily water, but it's also going to hold some nutrients as well. And this is called cerebral spinal fluid. And so these ventricles are going to contain this fluid. And basically, if this is my brain and my spinal cord, surrounding your entire brain and spinal cord, you will have fluid on the inside, and then all the way around on the outside, you will have CSF surrounding your brain and your spinal cord. So your ventricles are what's going to hold that liquid inside the brain. So the first one inside this section right here, inside the brain, is going to be called the lateral ventricles. And these lateral ventricles are large C-shaped chambers that are located deep within each right or left hemisphere. So basically right inside here, there'll be this little chamber that looks like this C shape right here. So that's if you're looking straight on the side. But what it's really going to do is it's going to be a fluid filled, so it will show up kind of hollow section of a chamber deep inside the brain. So this is that C-shaped right here where you can see that. If you're looking at it from the back, you'll note, or the front, you'll notice that that C shape continues here as well, and there is one in the right side and the left side. So that's where you're going to start with your fluid inside your brain. Those are called your lateral ventricles. After your lateral ventricles, the fluid that will be around your brain will go through the third ventricle. Do not ask me why they go from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricles and not the secondary. I feel like it is because the lateral ventricle has a right and a left. Therefore, the next one would be first and second are already taken, so therefore it's the third ventricle. That is simply my assumption. So after this liquid goes through the right and the left lateral ventricles, it then will flow down to the third ventricle. So that would be the section where they come together right there. From the lateral ventricles, it will then flow into the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle is going to be the lower section of the brain. And that is going to be right here. And then after this fourth ventricle, it will then actually go two different directions. After the fourth ventricle, it will then be a continuous with the central column of the spinal cord. And then it will also go and surround the brain. So after it goes from the lateral ventricles, third ventricles, fourth ventricles, it will then go two places, and this will be down and around the spinal cord. And then the next part it will go would be around the actual brain itself. So it'll cycle back around the brain. So an example of that is going to be, it'll come down through here, and it'll either keep going down or it will come and circle back around the brain. Okay, so some terminology to, since we've already used it, but to make sure that this next couple sections are going to be straight anatomy of the brain. And so we're going to start with the anatomy of the brain with what the cerebral hemispheres are. So it is plural, which means there is a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. And it's the most superior part of the brain. It's the brain that you think of when you think of the brain. It's about 83% of our brain mass is actually going to be this cerebral hemispheres. So there's a couple terms to talk about. It is a folded and it is a convoluted surface. So when we say it's a convoluted surface, it is not flat. So these terms will be our landmarks to our brain. So gyri is going to be a ridge. So if we have this, the ridge is going to be the gyrus. Gyri would be plural, but it will, gyrus is singular. A sulcus or a sulci is going to be the shallow groove. So that would be this guy. He would be the sulcus or the sulci. However, it's a shallow groove. You may have something that is not a shallow groove, but it will be like this, more of a fissure. This guy's going to be a deep groove. So there's a couple places on our brain that are called fissures. And this fissure could be a longitudinal fissure, which is the one that will go straight down the middle right here. You see how that's a really deep, erase that so you can see it. That's a deep fissure. This would be the longitudinal fissure right here that goes all the way down the middle of the brain. Or the transverse fissure, which will separate the cerebrum and the cerebellum. and we don't have that view. We have it right here. So you can see that right there. Those are the two major fissures. All of the other folded pieces are going to be made by the gyrus and the sulcus. So that's those two terms, and those are going to be our landmarks when we're talking about the brain. So each sulci, so the grooves, will divide the brain into 5 lobes, and these are going to be the 5 lobes. So these mirror actually the bones of the skull. So these are super easy to remember. Your brain looks like this. These are your eyes, so you're looking forward. This is the anterior, this is the posterior side. So there will be the frontal lobe of the brain, and there is a fissure that will divide that. So this will be your frontal lobe. And then you're going to have your parietal lobe, which will be this section, your parietal lobe. And then your parietal lobe will be separated by another lightly with a sulci, which would separate there's a little sulci right here, and that would separate this next lobe right here, which is going to be your occipital lobe. And then the way that this sulcus right here, that's actually a fissure, and your sulcus right here will separate everything. That will then also separate it into your temporal lobe, which is this guy right here. This is your temporal lobe. And again, these look very similar to the bones of the skull. If you were to pull apart this section right here, underneath you would have a lobe called the insula. And that's if you essentially just take this temporal section and kind of pull it away. It is found underneath there. So these are the 5 major divisions of the hemisphere, and you do need to know them, and they're named for the skull. So you can kind of see, here's another perspective to see those here. And again, here is the insula when you pull it away. So within this cerebral hemisphere, it will actually divide these lobes. So when we're looking at, where is the brain? These actual divisions of our cerebral hemispheres, it is going to be split by, here's a central sulcus, is the sulcus that will be splitting the frontal from our parietal lobe. So that central sulcus is going to be dividing down the middle. Essentially, it looks like a headband that goes from ear to ear. Then you're going to have that parieto-occipital sulcus that will separate the occipital and the parietal lobes. So that is going to be, I believe I have covered it up, but that's this guy right here who is separating the parietal and the occipital lobe. And then another one that you were going to have is going to be your lateral sulcus, which will outline the temporal. And so that one will be found right there. That is outlining your temporal lobe. So these sulcus give us the outline and the landmarks of our brain. Okay, when we talk about the cerebral cortex, we are saying it is the executive suite of the brain. Basically what that means, this is where we will have all of our conscious, higher level awareness of who we are. So this is going to be our conscious mind. It's where we have the ability to sense things. It's where we have the ability to think through things. It's where we have the ability to rationalize and to control our muscles. So this is where we're going to have our conscious mind. So that's important. It is actually going to be a thin, superficial layer of gray matter. So it's only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. So remember, our cerebral cortex is all folded. And the reason it's folded is that it will actually increase the surface area to have this folded. And so when we're saying that it's a very superficial layer of gray matter for our cortex, we are saying that essentially just that top itty bitty part right here is only going to be this 4 millimeter maximum measurement right there. So it can be a very, very small. But overall, your brain takes up 40% of the mass of your brain. The cerebral cortex takes up 40% of your overall brain. And what's really cool about this is we know that your brain will have specific motor and sensory areas that will show up during PET scan or fMRI. So here's an example of a brain during an MRI. So the brain is doing this again. So this is the anterior and the posterior on all these images. When you see, this part of the brain lights up, and we know that's responsible for being able to see. If you hear, this part of the brain lights up. If you speak, this part, and if you think, all of the areas light up. So this is how we know that different areas of the brain are responsible for different functions. Okay, so real quickly, there's 4 major general characteristics of the cerebral cortex. 4 generalizations. This is just to keep things in perspective as you go throughout this section. The first one is that of these, all the areas we're going to talk about, there are 3 types of functional areas. And these 3 types of functional areas, there's going to be motor areas that produce motor movement. There's going to be sensory areas, which allow you to receive sensory information, process it, and figure out what it is. And then there's going to be association areas. And association areas are essentially going to do everything all together, make a bunch of things work seamlessly and all together. So we're essentially going to talk about motor, sensory, and association. That's how we're going to divide up this first half of the chapter. So another generalization, and we know it's a generalization because there are certain things that activate more, activate less. You're not just motor and sensory, so science is still looking at this generalization. But the second one is going to be that each hemisphere is concerned with the contralateral or the opposite side of the body. So basically, if this is my lovely little human right here, there are 2 sides of his brain. He's going to have his left side right here, and then he's going to have his right side. And basically what we mean when we say that the contralateral side is that if this is the left side of my brain, that is actually going to be controlling all of the pieces of the right side of the body. So left side of the brain, right side of the body. But if it's the left side of the brain, it is controlling or responsible for the left side of the body. So this is what we mean by each hemisphere is concerned with the contralateral or the opposite side. Then there's another one that's called the lateralization or the specialization, can only occur in one hemisphere. And we know that's not true because your hemispheres have the ability to specialize. And that's really, really cool. So one hemisphere can specialize over the other. And then the conscious behavior controls the entire thing. We are aware that this process is very, very, very oversimplified. We do not know a lot about the brain. Research into this world really only started in the late 60s and 70s because of technology. So these are generalizations and considerations, but we do think science thinks that these are true. So we're going to start with this motor area, sensory area, and association. So this is how we're going to look at the next couple areas. So inside our cerebral cortex, we're going to start with our motor areas, the areas of our brain that are responsible for motor movement. So these are going to be found in the frontal lobe, and they are going to control voluntary movement. So this is the movement that you make with your skeletal muscles specifically. This is not digestive muscles, muscles of the eye. Well, no, it is muscles of the eye. Muscles of the smooth glands or the cardiac muscles. Whew, there we go. Motor areas is going to cover our voluntary or our skeletal muscles. It is in the frontal lobe. So the motor areas are going to be these right here. This is going to be your motor area. It is going to be called the primary motor cortex. So that is the important part. So in your brain, this motor area right here, you have your central sulcus that is splitting. Your motor area is going to show up in the frontal lobe right here. That's the primotor motor area. And this motor area is going to be responsible for the conscious control of that skeletal muscle. And these are really long neurons that have to go all the way down to the spinal cord and then all the way down to potentially the tips of your toes. These are very, very, very long neurons. There's also something called the premotor cortex, which is right in front of this. So it's just a small little section that is right here, and that would be the prefrontal cortex, right, premotor cortex. So those are important, and that helps with refinement of some movements. And then we do a lot as humans that is related to speech and language. So the ability to move our mouth in order to speak is a very refined movement. So we have a specific area of our brain that is responsible for controlling motor movement that is related to speech. So right here in this little section right here is where you will find Broca's area. So this is what we're looking at for that. And this is going to be Broca's. So Broca's is a language, but it is specifically going to be related to the ability to speak, production of language, movement of oral motor muscles. And then there's also an area that's your frontal eye field, which will be right about here, and that is going to control your eye movement. Again, this is skeletal muscle, so that's where you will control your eye movement, which is very, very important to who we are. Then you're also going to have your inside that primary motor cortex that we talked about. A little bit more information about this. So this is going to be the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. As we go through this chapter, there will be a lot of this type of information written. So basically how you read it is you first start with, okay, frontal lobe. So I know where that is. That's essentially the front of my brain behind my forehead. And then the precentral gyrus. So if this is my frontal lobe, I know it's here. This is my central gyrus. We are talking about the precentral gyrus. So we're talking about the bump. So remember gyrus fissure, gyrus and sulcus. This is a gyrus. So when you have the bump right here, that is the precentral, it's this guy, gyrus. So up here, here's my central sulcus. You see how this is the bump. So it's the precentral, it's right before. I'm saying that because we will also have a post-central gyrus, which essentially does the same thing. So when you're trying to find out where everything is, these terms are pretty complex of where things are. The important thing for this one is going to be called this somatopy, or this motor homunculus. So basically, homunculus or homunculi, I've heard it pronounced both ways. Basically what we're saying, that if this is your brain, here's right, here's left, this is the front if you're looking at it, here are my eyeballs. So now we're doing it from the top down. If these are my eyeballs, here's my precentral sulcus. So we are talking about this section right here. This is my primary motor cortex. So if we're actually looking right here, remember we control the opposite side of the body. So this is the right side of my brain, and this is the left side of my brain. All the way down this headband type section, you're going to have specific areas that are arms, legs, toes, tongue, that essentially relate to specific areas of our body. And that's what this motor homunculus is. It's a cartoon caricature, and it shows the contralateral side, so the opposite side of the body that is responsible for innervating that movement. So again, here's my eyeball, so I'm looking straight ahead. Here's my central sulcus. Here's my precentral gyrus right here, so you can see this right here. He's the blue. sorry, he's the red. So this is going to be the anterior. So it is actually flipped from my drawing. Please keep that in mind. This is the anterior, this is the posterior. So it's opposite my picture. So the one that is in front is going to be this motor cortex. And so you can see if you go down the center, you will have different areas of this that are responsible for picking up a sensation or moving the muscles of different parts of your body. So that's really, really cool that we can actually pinpoint exactly on our brain the muscle that is being controlled, and we can move that muscle. It's really, really, really cool. Okay, so there's also a premotor cortex, like we said, that lies in front of the primary motor cortex, and really it helps with skilled motor activities. So repetitious activities, patterning activities, simultaneous activities. It essentially is coordinating activities. We also said that there was Broca's area, so would be our speech production. This is where we are actually talking. We're moving our muscles of our mouth. And then, as we said, there was also going to be the frontal eye field that controls our voluntary eye movement. So all of this is that we've taken the brain and then essentially just split it in half. So you're only looking with this perspective right here. You're only looking at the right hemisphere right here. So you essentially, it's kind of like a nut. You've taken it and you've cracked it in half. So this is only looking at the right hemisphere, but you would have a similar, almost identical left hemisphere for you to see. Okay, one thing that's really important to this is damage. So the brain, or the central nervous system, as we talked about with neurons, doesn't necessarily have the ability to regenerate. So if there is damage, there are issues. So if there is any damage to the primary motor cortex, it will usually be seen as a stroke, and usually on the opposite side of the body. So if this is my brain right here, here's my central sulcus, here's my premotor cortex. If there is damage right here, then the other side of the body of whatever that is responsible for will be paralyzed because that muscle is no longer being controlled by the brain. So that's what happens a lot with stroke victims, where they have a stroke on one side of the brain and the other side of the body is impacted. Okay, so then we're going to look at our sensory areas. So that was our motor areas. Now we're going to go and look at our sensory areas, so the areas of the brain that make up our sensory components. This is our awareness of sensation. So this is not the receiving of it, but where we put meaning to it. And they will essentially occur in all the lobes. And there are 8 primary main areas. So we're just going to briefly go through these. So the first one, we're just going to put them all on one brain. That is a very bad brain. So here we go. There we go. Here's our overall our brain. So we've already talked about our motor cortex, but here's our somatosensory cortex. So it will actually live on the postcentral gyrus. So this is our primary somatosensory cortex. It is on the postcentral gyrus. So just on the other side. This is where we'll be receiving information from our proprioceptors, our sensory information, our information from our skin, our joints, our tendons. It's where we essentially are touching items. So this is where we'll have touch. There's also something called the somatosensory homunculus. So now we're going to have this guy. So the somatosensory homunculus is built the same way. There is going to be a right, this is my brain. Here's my central sulcus. The primary sensory cortex that has the homunculus is actually going to be the one that is behind. And this area could be toes. This area could be mouth. This area could be finger of your right hand. You can actually have all of these individual paces. So what's tricky and weird with this image is it makes it look like your right has your motor and your left has your sensory. That is not the case. It is essentially like wearing two full headbands. You will have one headband that is only going to be sensory, and he will just go like that, and then you have a second headband that will be motor, and he sits right in front. So it's technically 2-inch wide hair bands about that sit on top of your head that go all the way across, and each side will control the opposite side of the body, but there's one headband. This image is confusing because it makes it seem like there's half a headband of each kind put together, and that's not what is true. Okay, there's also a somatosensory association cortex, which is going to be like a secondary cortex. And this is where you'll get size, texture, and relationships of objects determined and figured out, because your somatosensory is going to be telling you the shape, the general texture, and some other just characteristics about it. Okay, you have another sensory area, which is going to be your visual area. And your primary visual area will be located in the posterior part of the occipital lobe. And it's also going to have a visual association area, which is essentially like the secondary. So this is the primary that lives in the back of the occipital lobe, and then there will also be the visual association area that will surround it. So the primary visual is very interesting because our eyes are all the way up here. So our information from our eyes is having to travel all the way through from our eyes essentially into our brain through a very complex pathway, and then eventually get to our primary visual cortex. Okay, another sensory information type that we're going to have is sound. So if we have our brain that looks like this, our primary auditory cortex is super important. And that is going to sit right around here. And that primary auditory cortex allows us to perceive the sense of sound and a little bit of vestibular as well. But this is where you can pick up the different sensations. Your vestibular cortex will be underneath all this in your insula right there. And that will be where you can find your vestibular cortex that is picking up this information. Vestibular will be conscious awareness of balance, so how you are holding your head in space. Essentially, are you dizzy when you go on car trips or do roller coasters, or do you really need to do a roller coaster and it doesn't impact you at all? All of that is the position of your head relative to the body, relative to gravity. That is vestibular cortex. Okay, another one you're going to have is your olfactory cortex. And this is your primary olfactory, is going to be smell. And when we're talking about the primary olfactory cortex as smell, it is picking up information from the smell receptors in the nose. So it is going to be on the underside of our brain, right around here. It's our primary olfactory cortex, and it's the conscious awareness of our odors and our smell. Okay, the next one is going to be the gustatory cortex, and gustatory essentially is going to be taste. And that is going to be deep to the temporal lobe. So if this guy, he's essentially going to be, let me get the right thing. Gustatory cortex is going to be right about there. And then you'll also have one called the visceral sensory area, which is going to be right behind that-ish. And this is where you will have conscious perception of your inside information. So visceral would be your internal state. So this is where you're able to feel pain, pressure, hot, cold, whatever it may be, deep from inside of your body. So damage to any one of these areas can result in challenges with that sensory information. So for example, damage to the primary visual cortex results in blindness. So it's really important to know where damage to the brain is, as damaged in certain places can cause lots of challenges. Okay, we said that there was the motor, there was sensory, and then there was going to be multimodal or association areas. And these association areas make up the rest of the cortex and essentially all work together. So it's a very simple concept, so we're just going to run through the names of some of our association areas. So these are receiving inputs from lots of sensory areas. That could be smell plus vision plus skeletal muscle, and we're moving, so that way we know there's something going on. It could be hearing and vision, and we're taking in instructions from a teacher. So it doesn't matter. Multimodal associations is receiving inputs from different types of sensory areas, and it could be a lot. And then it's communicating to a bunch of different areas. And the whole purpose of this is to give meaning to the information that we pick up, store it in our memory, tie it to experience, and then use it. So being able to provide output that relates to that sensory information. Basically, it's what makes us and who we are. So this is a really, really, really important area, and there's 4 types that we're going to talk through. So the first one is going to be the anterior association area. This is primarily going to be called the prefrontal cortex. So if you've heard the prefrontal cortex, this is now also being called the anterior association area. I like the prefrontal cortex still. So basically what we're saying is that this front half of the brain right here is our most complicated cortical region. This is where we will have our intellect, our personality, our reasoning, our logic, everything that makes us higher level humans, where we have the ability to think through things, process, and provide organized output, is going to be found in this prefrontal cortex. It's also responsible for higher level thinking, things such as memory, working memory, abstract ideas, being able to do judgment, plan your environment, all of those things. Prefrontal cortex or anterior association. Then there's also a posterior association, and it's the large region essentially that is left. So I'm just going to color it in on this same area right here, on this same picture, just to kind of help put it into perspective. So your posterior association area is essentially this type of area. So it's around all the other sensory cortexes. It's a large region. It plays a role in recognizing patterns, recognizing words, recognizing shapes and colors, and being able to assign meaning to all of that. One thing that's also cool is there's another language area. So way back here is going to be Wernicke's. And just like we had Broca's for speech production, the ability to move your mouth to produce words, Wernicke's is going to be speech understanding. Can you understand what is going on? So this is what's happening with stroke patients when they say blink once for yes and blink twice for no, or whichever one it is. Because they have brain damage in the area that's responsible for producing speech, so they can't talk. But brain damage has not occurred in the area where they're understanding speech, which is Wernicke's, so they can understand it. They just can't talk. So that's a very, very, very important piece of how Broca's and Wernicke's work together. Okay, the other association area is going to be the limbic association area. And essentially, this is going to be our emotions and our memories. So, anytime you see limbic, start thinking of memory, and any memory that is tied to an emotion will also be included. The limbic system is going to be talking about how we have our memory. Okay, so when we're looking at any kind of tumor, lesion, or injury to an anterior association area, which is that prefrontal cortex, as I said, that's where your personality can reside. So that can result in a change in a personality disorder, being able to lose judgment, logic, reason, all of those pieces. So brain damage is important to be able to keep an eye on. Brain damage to the frontal lobe essentially can shift the personality of someone completely. Okay. We said that there was one of the general rules of thumb was lateralization of cortical functioning, meaning different hemispheres will have different responsibilities. So our right and our left hemisphere are not identical. They're very similar. They're almost identical, but they're not quite identical because there is a thing called cerebral dominance, which is whichever hemisphere is dominant for language. So 90% of humans will have left-sided dominance. And if they have left-sided dominance, so here's my brain. So right, left. If they have left-sided dominance, that means that they are using the other side of their body. So that means they have right-sided handedness. Most individuals are right-handed. Therefore, most individuals, 90%, are left brain dominant. The opposite is actually going to be true. Some will, about 10% will have right-sided hemispheric specialization. And these are usually going to be tied because they have left-handedness. But some people will just have the hemisphere switched into their language hemisphere switched to the opposite hemisphere. So that's few and far between, about less than 10%, but that does exist. But cerebral dominance, or the hemisphere that is dominant, is related to which hand is in use. And there's some general rule of thumb. So these are essentially just characteristics. However, there is truth to this statement. I apologize, it closed out my screen. So let me pull that up and we'll talk through the lateralization. Great. Okay, so this last section is with our right and our left hemisphere, knowing that there's some lateralization occurring. Okay, it won't let me delete it. Well, we'll just leave it there. But there is a difference in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. So this is a general characteristic, but there is some truth to the fact that the left hemisphere is responsible for controlling language, math, and logic, more detail-oriented pieces of information, whereas your right hemisphere is going to be more largely used during visual spatial perspectives, intuition, emotion, artistic, and musical abilities. So all of that is kind of a good rule of thumb. Okay. So moving into 12. Oh, so sorry. My thing has done an update and it is not liking OneNote. Okay, so this next section is going to be 12.2, and we're going to be talking about the cerebral white matter that is found in our hemispheres. So basically, this is the communication pathways that we're going to have from section to section. So cerebral white matter. Remember, white matter means that they're axons, so there is myelin. So there are three basic regions inside our cerebral hemisphere. Cerebral white matter is one of them. And basically, it's the communication between all areas of the brain. Again, it is myelinated fibers. So these fibers are going to be classified based on the direction that they run. So there's association, commensal, and projection. So first off, the fibers is classified by the direction of the fiber. So there are 3 directions the fibers can go. They can either go same hemisphere, they're just going to different parts. This is the association. So if we come down here, how we are going to have our association fibers are this guy. So it's here, and then it's connecting to here. And then it can connect here and connect here. So that is the same hemisphere. All of that is happening on the left side. Okay, the second one is going to be the commissural fibers. And these are going to be connecting the 2 hemispheres. So it's going to be going between the right and the left hemispheres. So the big one here is going to be the corpus callosum, because that is running from the 2 sides. So our commissural fibers, I covered it up, I apologize, are going to be the ones that are going from side to side. So you can see these here. There's some commissural fibers there. And they are running and connecting side to side. The biggest one that is your commissural is going to be your corpus callosum, which connects, it's the major pathway between the right and the left side of the body. And there's another type of fiber direction it can go. It can actually go essentially lower brain to upper brain. So it can connect height within the brain. It will travel from low to high. These are going to be projection fibers. So you're projecting things from one area to the other. So this one's hard to see from this perspective, but it's great for this perspective for you to be able to see that we are actually sending information from here to here. This is a lower, this is a higher region of the brain. And remember, this is a neural tube, so we develop like this. So this is the highest point in our brain. That's why this is considered lower right here, and this is considered higher. But that would be an example of a fiber that will go from a low region to a higher region in the brain, otherwise known as a projection fiber. Okay, another section that we're going to talk about is going to be your basal nuclei. And this is essentially going to be the 3rd basic region of our cerebellum, of our cerebrum, or our 2 hemispheres. And the basal nuclei are going to consist of these 3 structures. And basically what you need to know about the basal nuclei is, in a simple terms, that this is going to be a collection of cell bodies. And while those cell bodies are very important and they all do different things, it's a very complex of how they all work together. So what I want you guys to know is that the basal nuclei, caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus, essentially is just going to be a little group of cell bodies found together. So this is just kind of a collection of cell bodies. So you can see how they're 3-dimensional with these 3 areas, because it is essentially just a collection of cell bodies. But they have a really important function with this basal nuclei. So while they are a collection of cell bodies, the functions of the basal nuclei kind of relate to motor movement. So we don't know exactly what the basal nuclei do, but their function is related to some sort of a motor movement, muscle movement, cognition, stereotyped movements, inappropriate responses, antagonistic, doing the opposite. So it's really, research is out and doesn't really know what these cell bodies kind of do, but we do know very much so that if they go wrong, such as in Parkinson's and Huntington's, basal nuclei is impacted, and that process is actually known. So that's a very cool process. So you can just see how it's a collection of cell bodies. Okay, so the next section is going to be the diencephalon. So 12.2 was telencephalon, which was the cortex, which is the most anterior part of the prosencephalon. So next we're going to talk about the diencephalon, which is the second part that is broken out of the prosencephalon. So the diencephalon essentially is going to be made up of three structures: thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. So the diencephalon of these three structures, we're going to do a brief overview of them all. So we're living in thalamus. Ooh, so sorry. We're living in this world right here. Thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. So we're kind of right here. So the first one is going to be the thalamus. When we're talking about the thalamus, this is the relay station for all incoming information, all incoming sensory information. So basically anything that comes through from the body of pain, temperature, smell, well, actually not smell, vision, everything has to go through this thalamus section first. And it is going to be responsible for receiving information from the sensory information and then passing it to other sections and areas within the brain. So it's the main relay station. It will edit inputs, it will figure out where it needs to go, and overall it'll just kind of keep everything working together smoothly. So your thalamus is really, really, really important because the key role in sensation is being able to understand and get it all. So it will have inputs from pretty much all incoming information. It's very, very cool. Next one is going to be your hypothalamus. Hypo really kind of means under, so that's where that name comes from because it is below. And what's important for the hypothalamus is that, yes, it's below the thalamus, so it's kind of related to those, but this will be it's going to be, I feel like, this slide down here. Yep. It is the major visceral control area. Your hypothalamus is going to be the major control of visceral information. So that means it will have a large homeostatic role to maintain your internal steady state. So how it does that, how it is the chief homeostatic control, is it will actually control your ANS, or your autonomic nervous system. And your ANS will control your fight or flight. So that's a very important topic. We'll talk about that in chapter 14. But what it will do with this autonomic nervous system is regulate your blood pressure, your heart rate, your pupil size, whether or not you are digesting or not digesting. So that's really, really, really important with all of the functions that your ANS can do. It's also going to initiate a physical response to any kind of emotion. So this is when you're going on a job interview and you're nervous and your palms are sweating or your heart is racing. That would be your hypothalamus controlling all of these features. Or you're going on a first date and all of that same premise applies. Being nervous, hands are sweaty, flushed face, all of that is related to your hypothalamus controlling this information. Your hypothalamus, besides just those two, also regulates your body's temperature. So we talked about this in the first chapter when we did homeostasis, that it was your hypothalamus in your brain that did your temperature. It's also responsible for food intake, whether or not you're hungry or not, or whether or not you're full or not. So that's important. It also controls your water balance and whether or not you're thirsty, so your water intake. But then it also will help with your sleep-wake cycle. So it works with your pineal gland to really be able to regulate your sleep and your wake cycle. So your hypothalamus is very, very, very important for all of these reasons. Okay. It will also be responsible for secreting some hormones, which is also important for secreting pituitary, anterior, and posterior. So it will control hormone release, which is very important. If there's any issues with your hypothalamus functioning, here's just a couple examples of how some things can go wrong if that homeostatic mechanism gets messed up. And then the third structure for this diencephalon was your epithalamus. And your epithalamus, the main focus here is it will contain your pineal gland, which will secrete melatonin that is responsible for your sleep-wake cycle. So if here is my brain, your epithalamus will kind of be around here. Trying to, this is going to be a deep inside, and your epithalamus will kind of be sticking out right there. And that is where you'll have your pineal gland, which helps regulate your sleep-wake cycle with sleep. So you can see how this is your brainstem, and we're talking about these sections essentially right now. So moving into that area is our brainstem. So the brainstem is going to be the bottom half of your brain. So we're going to just do a brief overview on these structures right here. It will contain these three regions. Your brainstem includes your midbrain, your pons, and your, sorry, not four, medulla oblongata. These are going to be primarily fiber tracts that are connecting higher and lower. So if we are in this section of the brain, these guys connect from your spinal cord up to your brain and from your brain down to your spinal cord. So they will be primarily carrying tracts or information. So they're going to be more relay stations. Okay, so to start with our midbrain, out of our three regions, we're going to do midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So the first one is our midbrain. The big information that you really need to know here for the midbrain is that this is responsible for controlling the fight or flight response. So this is where you will have your autonomic nervous system activated, and you will either stand up and increase your hormones, or you will turn them off and essentially not fight. So you'll either fight or you will run away. You'll have two different hormones that kind of control this process. We'll talk about that in chapter 14. But the fight or flight is actually controlled there in your midbrain. You're also going to have a section in your midbrain that is called your substantia nigra. And inside this midbrain, the substantia nigra. So nigra is a black coloration. So it's based off of the Latin name for that, substantia, if I can spell it right. And it's essentially substantia, meaning that there's a substantial amount of this coloration collected. So it's essentially going to be a dark spot in the brain. What we know about the substantia nigra is that this is where Parkinson's disease has been implicated. So we know that this area is responsible for Parkinson's disease. So that's a really, really, really cool way to be able to know that. So just coming down and looking at this guy, You can see how I said it was a dark section. It really is these selections right here, where it's this dark area that will be your substantia nigra. Okay, so you have two more. It's going to be your pons. And when we're looking at your pons, it's connected between the two. And the big takeaway for this pon is that it's really going to be tracts. And these two tracts are going to be those that are longitudinal fibers that are connecting lower and higher. So that would be those longitudinal fibers that are connecting lower and higher. Or it'll be the transverse dorsal fibers that will go the same level, and it will go between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. So those are the two types. Really, the pons is a train station where things are just passing through. You can see that on this image. Okay, so the last part of our brainstem is going to be your medulla. It is more commonly called the medulla rather than the medulla oblongata, but that is the full official term, is medulla oblongata. And this is actually going to be this, the base of this is going to be the start of the spinal cord. So that's going to be very, very, very important. And this is where you're going to see that fourth ventricle where we talked about your CSF. So this is what will be found in this medulla oblongata. And the big thing to really know about this is something called the decussation of the pyramids. And this is where you will actually have tracks cross over to the opposite side of the body. So if this is my brain, spinal cord, backbone, whatever, here's my body. At this point here, we know that the information that has traveled from here is traveling up to the brain. But here we say it crosses to the other side and goes up. So this is where you will actually have information cross to the other side of the body. And that's the really important part of the decussation of the pyramids. Your medulla oblongata has a couple different functions as well. And so these are the primary functions of the medulla oblongata. It's really, really, really important with being a reflex center, specifically an autonomic one. It's also responsible for cardiovascular, so being able to increase or decrease the rate of your heartbeat, or to increase or decrease the diameter of your blood vessels in order to regulate your blood pressure. So he is very, very, very important in both autonomic nervous system, cardiovascular system, also the respiratory system, because he will generate your breathing rhythm and the rate and depth of your breathing. That is a big one for your medulla. And then he's also responsible, this area, because it's got so many homeostatic mechanisms related to the autonomic nervous system. Some of those that can go wrong on a very small scale are vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing. These are all the not normal but need to occur. Nothing is really wrong. These are all controlled by your medulla oblongata. So this video will stop there.